Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. We got another solo album review, this time of a double album from Eric Church called Heart and Soul. So here's a fun question. What genre of music does Eric Church make? Now, the easy answer, just say, he makes country music. He's a Nashville fixture. Duh. And for his first three albums, I'd say that makes some sense, or even for isolated singles from his next three albums. But the truth is that Eric Church has been in his own lane for a while now, and it's worth noting that he kind of knows it. I find it way easier to compare Eric Church to someone like Sturgill Simpson, who treats genre with casual disinterest and will just open up into pure rock music live. But even that is not quite right, because Sturgill Simpson has been way more forward-thinking and wild than Eric Church has been. And even then, Eric Church did release The Outsiders, and even if the prog metal country genre pile-up experiment didn't work at all, and I blame his longtime producer Jay Joyce for more of that and plenty of other things, but even still, I think I probably should revisit that album and that review at some point. It's not one of my better reviews. It was at least fascinating, and hell, he followed it a year later with his best album in Mr. Misunderstood, and even then I would struggle to call everything on that project pure country as well. But what I think truly flipped a switch with me for Eric Church was seeing him live in early 2019, and I highly recommend everyone who can do so, because not only was he going to play a full 3-hour set with no opener, you're going to get your money's worth, he also sounds way more powerful and anthemic in an arena or stadium compared to on wax. And that raised way more questions than it should. For an artist who's been so heavily criticized for not being able to sell all the bombast he attempts, especially vocally, it made me seriously question just how much more his production has been hampering him from truly bringing to life that textured mid to late 80s Americana that he worships so deeply. And it left me with a lot of questions going into this album here too. Now, to break this down, one disc is called Heart, the other one is called Soul, and there's an EP called And that's only available to his diehard fan club, specifically and streaming there very exclusively and on vinyl, and he calls that fan club the Church Choir. Normally I've got a rule in not covering these sorts of exclusives not available to everyone, but I wanted to give this a chance with the expectation the EP was probably going to wind up on streaming or YouTube anyway, mostly because with this sort of structure, it was clear Eric Church was using his added time off to make another ambitious grand slam. Now again, the last time he really tried this, it didn't quite work, but Eric Church is the sort of artist who can pivot and make the right sort of course correction, and he has learned from his mistakes in the past. Now, whether or not Jay Joyce has is a very different question, but alright, what did we get from Heart and Soul? Well, this is tricky. The best way to describe this project, it might be sprawling, not just in the tones owing their obvious debts to Bruce Springsteen and John Mellencamp, but in how Eric Church used the expanded runtime over 2.5 discs to adventure into sounds and genres he probably otherwise wouldn't touch on a traditional full-length Nashville country album without it turning into a mess. Hell, again, he's been down that road a few too many times already. But with all that sprawl does come some drawbacks that rear their heads around a lot of corners and prevent this from reaching its true grand potential for me. The odd feeling that some of the genre explorations are kind of half-formed, maybe could have used a second or third draft to really reach their potential. How, at this point of his career, Eric Church could have probably used at least one other producer or collaborator in the room to realize more of that potential. And how, even with all the sprawl, how much more of this really adds up to more? It's an open question mark, especially if you don't hear the And EP, and that might contain some of the best material of his entire career. Now, coupled with the expected double album issues and pacing, and the fact that this probably could have been chopped down to a solid 12 to 15 songs, I'm still left liking this a lot, but I'm left thinking this should be better than it is. I do think this is on the cusp of greatness, but the whole project could have been beyond that. Now, to be fair, I actually get why the album's structured like this. Eric Church has described his writing process for this as almost like an assembly line, where he would write the song in the evening and night, refine the drafts in the afternoon and morning of the next day, and then cut it by the end of the day, where he just got into a real rhythm and was just churning out material during lockdown. And yet suddenly I was starkly reminded of when the Jonas Brothers did something very similar for their 2019 comeback album, and how that project often felt underwritten, underproduced, even underthought and underwhelming. And while Eric Church is in a different ballpark when it comes to songwriting and compositional prowess, I cannot help but wonder if just a little bit more focus, a little bit more time could have been committed to some individual compositions, or any sort of thought surrounding a coherent arc or theme for the project as a whole. Now, for Eric Church's credit, there's always been a very loose and scattered feel around themes of his material, even among the albums I really like, and let's be real, it's not like Music Row is in a hurry to ask for the artistic album statement. But I also remember that the greater power that came from a project like Mr. Misunderstood that it had with its refinement in writing and themes, and showing just how much of the bravado was a lot of posturing and wish fulfillment from a misunderstood music nerd getting his chance to chase his dream. But I will say Desperate Man lost track of some of that emotional core. I mentioned that when I reviewed the album. And while Heart and Soul recaptures some of it, it's kind of fractured in a distancing way, especially if you don't have the Andy P, which, not to spoil, it's pretty much the entire emotional core of this endeavor. Now again, we'll get back into that when we talk about lyrics, but it's worth mentioning that this project is oddly structured as well, just the two discs, with Heart probably being the most focused and direct in traditional territory for him, while Soul shows the stuff that Eric Church wanted to venture out and explore, stretching even into Southern Soul and even disco on Look Good and You Know It and Break It kind of guy. A different sort of groovier vibe that doesn't really always square with the more straightforward country or heartland rock, where he even experiments with some falsetto, and frankly it works way more often than it should. He's actually pretty good in that range. The problem here is that said instrumentals in other genres, they often require a more robust arrangement or setup than his traditional country arrangements, and this is where we really have to talk about longtime producer Jay Joyce and his limitations here. Yeah, I'm gonna go back to this, and yes, he has gotten considerably better since The Outsiders, and to be fair, I'm not sure if there's any one producer who could have pulled everything Eric Church wanted to do on this project together at top quality, especially if they were working on a limited, isolated time frame for song after song in lockdown. This is probably where discipline, refinement on that basis could have really helped just a bit more time. But you know, even on the Heartland rock stuff, the stuff you should nail, and it's been an issue for years now with multiple artists, from Brandy Clark to the Brothers Osborne to Ashley McBride to even that last Miranda Lambert album, to even when he's gone to rock on occasion, Jay Joyce has a really bad habit of over-arranging the mix, where instead of letting the songs breathe naturally, letting the guitars really soar or explode, showcase some more dynamic swell, you're acutely aware of every time he's tuning the mix in order to allow that. It doesn't feel nearly as organic as it should, and it adds a weird stiffness to a lot of the textures, especially the percussion and any synth integration that seems to deflect from the impact or sweep these songs could have. I mean, at best you get the break into the acoustics after the solo on Heart on Fire, or the jerky but mostly effective crescendo on Brightside Girl. But as I said when I did my song review of Stick That in Your Country Song on Instagram last year, that song should have way more muscle to really nail the impact, especially with the lead guitar that has more texture than fiery tone. I mean, say what you will about all the production issues all over that last album from The Killers, Imploding the Mirage, but when they tried Heartland Rock, at least they, and the War on Drugs by extension, they knew how to create that organic swell without feeling as mechanical, like how Heart of the Night here never erupts properly, and it really should. But you know, considering just how many points where Eric Church wants to capture some of that same sort of bombast, Jay Joyce has really been the biggest underlying common factor for years now. Or you know, at the very least, he could have made it so the backing vocals don't occasionally sound like they're from a bad karaoke mix. Now granted, again, part of this might be a factor of how fast the songs were turned around, and if you're in lockdown and maybe you don't have access to the best of backing vocalists, but some of these mixes should not sound as thin or clunky as they do, glaring right at Never Break Hard and Love Shine Down here, although I've also got questions about how clunky the grooves are on Bunch of Nothing and Bad Mother Trucker as well. But then we get the points where Eric Church does want to experiment on cuts like Rock and Roll Found Me, that have got the right sort of vibe in this brand of reserved Southern soul, powerful, but they feel very undercooked and clunky in their arrangement than they should. You would expect a little more there. About the closest they get to making that relaxed southern swell working is the richer undercurrent of organ and squonking guitar on Look Good and You Know It. Because, let's be honest, the pulsating abusive reverb on the gungy break it kind of guy, it almost sounds like Eric Church was cribbing notes from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. But as such, I can absolutely conceive of a universe where this song kicks ass, but with that clap juxtaposed to the shuffling groove, it doesn't quite work. He probably needed other people in the studio to point that out. Now, I will say, there are some compositions that are so strong that the production really can't prevent them from cutting through and resonating. Helped along by Eric Church clearly trying way harder vocally on this project than anything he's touched before. He honestly sounds better here than on any previous album. Russian Roulette's got that piano line, the terrific driving bass, and the explosive bridge that reminds me in more ways than one of a cut from the late Jim Steinman, and it probably was an intentional reference. The stripped back acoustics on People Break and Leonard Skinner Jones that have enough texture and intimacy to really nail that vibe. Kind of a shame that Jenny can't pull itself together with the live pickups and its baffling Jennifer Lopez reference. And I would be remiss to not mention the And EP, which despite featuring one of the biggest experiments of this whole thing with the buzzed out, swampy southern rock of Dewside, featuring the most warm, robust, and refined mixing of the entire album, especially in the backing vocals. The synth-inflected atmosphere of Through My Ray-Bans and Kiss Her Goodbye, the shuffling acoustics of Doing Life With Me that ramps up amazingly well, later mirrored by the huge rattling acoustics of Lone Wolf, and how Madman splits the difference between the two. It's legit shocking how much higher the quality of that EP is overall, not just in the sound. And this is where we have to get to a lot of the content, because on the surface, for as sprawling as this album is, I would understand if someone might say there's more style than substance to the writing, or if it starts getting thin on the back half. And while I would disagree, I get why someone might say it. This has been a critique of Eric Church for a while. His writing is very stylized, paints in broader strokes, so if all you hear are scattered love songs, lingering heartbreak, and moments about how much swaggering rock star energy Eric Church has, I mean, I get it. And again, there are definitely clunky moments. Never Break Heart feels very cloying and thin. Bad Mother Trucker, I mean, the title is embarrassing, even despite the good intentions. And even if I appreciate the giant middle finger of Stick That in Your Country song, I said this when I reviewed it, it's not really a track that engages more deeply with the politics around its subject matter. And that does become a point to note here with Soul specifically, because Eric Church is intensely aware of the black roots of the music in which he's exploring. He mentions it lyrically, and you can tell he's approaching this material with reverence, like on Rock and Roll Found Me and the closing song Leonard Skinner Jones, telling a highly metaphorical story of a biracial kid finding his musical identity and passion after his parents met at a show for that titular band. Now, anyone who knows Leonard Skinner and both their iconography and their content might think Eric Church is wading into some messy territory from the band that wrote both the Ballad of Curtis Lowe and Sweet Home Alabama, but in truth, Eric Church is doing something very similar to what Alan Jackson did on Little Man, or how Eric Church himself interpolates a chunk of Ode to Billy Joe from Bobby Gentry, and I would put money on him knowing the larger context of that within country in both the song and the extended movie, but in presenting an uncomfortable truth that will be seen as political, because a whole lot of people don't want to hear or listen to that truth. But that's where I would argue the greatest strength of Eric Church's writing. An earnest sense of metatext, music about the power of music. So many of his songs about love and longing could easily be recast to his muses. He references music all the time. Russian Roulette and Stick That in Your Country song are some very pointed jabs at Music Row. It's the same subtext that made Mr. Misunderstood have such resonance for me, because for all of his craftsmanship, there's still a part of him still very starry-eyed, seeking that emotional magic. And that's the big reason why the And EP is not just essential listening, it might be among the best things he's ever done, because on songs like Through My Ray-Bans and Doing Life With Me, he opens up the framing, finds the community of people who can find that magic together in that music. Now, he's always going to feel somewhat isolated in chasing that muse, that's the role and weight of the artist, but there's such a sense of gratitude and populism, outright relief in finding that community. The connection, it's palpable. I mean, you can call it fan service, but there's reality to it. You know, if you see him live, you kind of get it. And as such, this is a really tough project for me to evaluate, and one I feel has been reviewed in an incomplete form more often than not. Most people haven't done the work to dig up the central and EP, and I feel like they've then missed both the heart and soul of the project. It's the key to the whole thing. But that's the problem when you structure a project like this and you wall off pieces as exclusive. Most people will be overwhelmed by the sprawl of just the double disc. They won't hear the greatness out of frame. They'll just consider it bonus cuts that, if they were good enough, would have been included on the main projects. And I mean, I get it. From a consumer standpoint, just considering heart or soul, you'd find them pretty good, but maybe not great or essential, especially if you've heard his larger catalog, handicapped by a lot of the typical double album issues and a drifting sprawl that only accentuates the flaws in the production and the compositions. And even including the EP, this could have been easily streamlined into Eric Church's best album, but it's also very clear he wanted to make a point with this song structure, deliver something very special to the diehard fans. The best commercial decision be damned. But as such, scoring it, for as much as anyone cares about the score, becomes a little ridiculous, because while I would give both heart and soul a 7 out of 10, stronger for the former, lighter for the latter, I would consider the and EP by itself a 9 out of 10. On its own, one of the best things I've heard all year, bar none, regardless of genre. And as a whole, I'll say it, the EP makes this better than the sum of its parts. At least to me, light 8 out of 10, high recommendations. And from there, I mean, the easy thing for me to say, I want Eric Church to at least try another producer or two, and he doesn't have to confine himself to just chasing Nashville radio either, but for a project that's probably going to go overlooked and not appropriately represented or reviewed, I'd say Heart and Soul is a great project, and though it might be a hefty time investment, or even cash investment, it's worth hearing. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know, a bit of a long review, I had a lot to say, and I understand if you don't want to look up the and EP, but trust me, it is so special, it's so good. Beyond that though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. About half the people who watch this video will not be subscribed. I highly recommend you do so. But beyond that, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help influence what reviews I put out, solo or on the Pulse, link to my Patreon right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times out there, but options available. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.